Okay, folks, so this could be a bit of a mission. I'm going to try and tackle planning. Now, planning policy is quite complicated in the sense that, well, it's complicated full stop, but also every site is different. Different authorities apply the National Planning Policy Framework in slightly different ways. So I'm going to have to be fairly generic and broad about the way I deal with this. And I'm sure there'll be many a planning consultant will be able to look at this and criticise some of the things I say. But what I'm trying to do is answer some of the common questions that come up when I'm talking to people, to clients, to prospective clients. We're trying to work out what likelihood their chances of getting planning on a particular plot. So we'll give it a crack, see how we get on. So I'm going to try and cover all the key points. I've made a few notes, so I may need to refer to those as we go through, so bear with me. But I'll see what I can do to answer all of the main points. I'm going to start off by talking about settlement boundaries. They're pretty relevant because I'm going to start at the easiest end of the spectrum, if you like, in terms of ease of getting planning permission on a given plot. And that is, if you have a plot with an existing residential dwelling on it, and you want to replace it with something of a similar size, and you're within a settlement boundary, then your chances of doing that are extremely good. So let's just talk about what a settlement boundary is. A settlement boundary will typically appear on your local planning authority website on a map, and for a given village, town, city, there will be a boundary around it drawn on a map within which, as I say, if you have a plot, your chances of being able to develop on it are high. Now, what you can put on it, of course, there are restrictions on, but in principle, you're going to almost certainly be able to get planning permission to build on it. Okay, so if you're looking for a site, or if you have a site with an existing house on it, it's within a settlement boundary, then there's a good chance you're going to be able to replace an existing dwelling, certainly of something of a similar size. Now, when we're talking about size here, we're talking about gross internal floor area, we're talking about the volume of the building, and we're talking about footprint. All of those can be relevant. If you're within a settlement boundary, the chances of increasing the size of that of an existing building, on the size of an existing building, are actually pretty good. Different if you're outside a settlement boundary, but we'll come on to that. Now, if you're looking to change the location of the dwelling on the site, again, if you're within a settlement boundary, you'll need to look at whether the new location you're proposing is within the sort of grain of development. By that I mean, if you're to look down in plan, and Google Earth is great for this, so if you go look at the site on Google Earth and you look at the development around it, have a look at the general line of development. That's the grain of development. In general terms, one would normally be expected to put a replacement dwelling along the general grain of development. Now, it's fair to say sometimes you look at residential areas and they don't really have a grain, and sometimes that can work in your favour. You say, well, actually there isn't a grain. The houses are generally sort of dotted around within their overall plots, in which case your chances of relocating somewhere else on the plot, of course, are quite good. If there is a very obvious grain or building line, let's just say all the houses either side of you are set back off the road by 20 metres, and there's nothing set further back than that, then there's a good chance that your house is going to need to fall in line with that line of development, that building line, that grain of development. So that's an issue that sometimes comes up. People ask, well, can I put it further back on the plot? That depends whether or not you're needing to fall in line with a grain of development and the general pattern of development around you. Okay, so let's just talk a little bit about plots that are within development boundaries but don't have a dwelling on them, and they often come in the form of either a large garden plot, so where somebody has a very large garden and they're considering building on part of that garden, or of course infill plots where you've got a piece of land with dwellings either side of it, and it looks like what we describe, say, an infill plot, where a dwelling would go on. It would infill that sort of grain of development we were talking about earlier. So those again are relatively straightforward. The size of the property you put on those plots would have to be proportionate to buildings around them. They would have to be appropriate to their environment in terms of design and materials and so on. But generally, if you're within a settlement boundary again, and you've got either a garden plot or an infill plot, your chances of getting planning should be reasonably good. Okay, so now let's move on to plots that are outside a settlement boundary. Now, first of all, I'm just going to talk about being physically outside a settlement boundary and physically within the boundaries of a village or hamlet. Now, by that I mean that a lot of villages and hamlets don't necessarily have a defined settlement boundary as drawn on a map, as we described earlier. But they do have, if you like, physical boundaries. So you might live in a small village, there is no defined settlement boundary, but if you've got a piece of land that could be described as being physically within the boundaries of the village. So a good example here is if you've got a fairly linear village and the development on one side of the road extends beyond development on the other side of the road, then where it doesn't extend as far, you could argue that a piece of land that is on the end of the other houses could argue to be within the development boundary, within the physical boundaries of the village, because development on the other side of the road extends beyond where you're planning to build, if that makes some sense. So there are cases where you can argue you're within the physical boundaries of a village, even when there isn't a defined settlement boundary. Now, of course, again, if you're looking to knock down and replace an existing dwelling, then that's far less contentious, because you're simply replacing, you're not adding to the number of dwellings, you're simply replacing one with another. Now, let's move on to where you might have a plot that's outside of a settlement boundary and not within the physical limitations of a village. Then you're now deemed to be in open countryside. Again, if you're knocking down and replacing a dwelling, then your chance of being able to do so are pretty good. As long as you're not talking about a listed building, you can almost certainly replace it. The question is what with, and it would have to be a building that is appropriate to its environment in terms of its design and materials and so on. But if you're knocking one down, you can probably replace it. Can you go bigger? Well, if you're in open countryside, which you will be if you're deemed to be outside a settlement boundary, then there are limitations on how much bigger you can go. And most authorities seem to use a figure of around about 30%. Now, you can make a case for a specific design that might be bigger, but argue that actually it's sympathetic to the environment around it. There are already other larger houses around it and so on. But as a measure, most authorities will use that sort of 30% rule. So if you're replacing a dwelling outside a settlement boundary, therefore deemed to be an open countryside, then increasing in size, you're probably going to be limited probably to about 30%. Bit of a caveat there, because they look at what they deem to be the original size of the building when they're calculating that 30%. And if the building is older than 1948, they look at the size of the building in 1948. So in other words, if your building was standing in 1948 and it has subsequently been significantly extended, you may have already used up that 30%, even well before you took the building on. So that's worth some consideration. But again, if you're knocking, just to reiterate, if you're knocking down a dwelling and replacing it, your chance of being able to do so are quite high. There may be some limitations on size. Whether you can relocate it on the site, of course, the same things apply as I mentioned earlier. That is there a grain of development that you need to consider? So let's move on then to plots that don't have an existing dwelling on. Then you really are reducing your chances of being able to get planning permission on it. One should never say never, but certainly the policies are generally against development of a plot in open countryside that is outside a development boundary. Okay, so I just want to talk a little bit about designated areas now. So I'm still talking about plots that are within settlement boundaries, but if you are in a settlement boundary and within a designated area, then there are other considerations. Now, by designated areas, I'm talking about conservation areas, green belt, AONB, area of outstanding natural beauty, SSSIs, sites of special scientific interest, and so on. So if you're within a settlement boundary, even if you're replacing a dwelling, or if you have an infill or garden plot, if you're in a designated area, then there are other considerations. Often, for example, in an AONB or a conservation area, there will be specific design guides you need to take into account. You need to take into account your impact, the impact of a design on those designated areas. So that's all really getting into quite specific scenarios there. So that's about as much as one can say at a broad level. There are quite a lot of other considerations if you're in a designated area. The other thing to bear in mind is that if your plot, and this quite often applies to garden plots, people come to us, they've got a nice garden plot, but it's within the curtilage of a listed building, or indeed even if it is a plot adjacent to the curtilage of a listed building. You really have to give a lot of consideration to the impact of a proposal on that listed building, whether that be a church, whether it simply be another dwelling that is listed. So the design has to take that into the impact of the new building on the listed building. And again, that's one of those things where you can only really deal with those by looking at the very specific set of circumstances. So I hope that's answered some questions for you. As always, if you've got a specific questions you want to talk about, a specific plot you want to talk about, you're always welcome to give us a call. You'll often end up speaking to me, and I will be able to look at a specific plot with you, find out a little bit about. We can do quite a lot online these days, so we can look at whether you're in a designated area. And obviously you'll know quite a bit about the plot already. So with that information, I can probably give you some guidance on your chances of getting planning permission on a specific plot. So even if you're looking at a plot, don't be afraid to give us a call. We're very happy to try and help out. We know there's an awful lot of information to try and take on in those early stages, and we're very happy to help where we can.